He kept fighting long after anyone else had stopped, not out of hatred, not for glory. He simply had an order he could not believe had been cancelled. For almost 30 years, a soldier lived in the shadow of a war that the rest of the world had declared over. He slept in the jungle. He ate what the land offered. He answered to a flag he had been taught to obey. This is the story of a man who refused to accept that an era had ended until a traveler and a command from the past finally reached him. He was trained as an intelligence officer in an army that believed in absolute duty. In late 1944, as Allied forces pushed across the Pacific, the young lieutenant was posted to a small Philippine island as Japanese positions collapsed. His orders were clear and unambiguous. Carry out guerrilla operations, do not surrender, and hold out until properly ordered to do otherwise. When the island fell and the ships left, the war that the world understood as over had not yet altered the single instruction he carried inside his uniform. The map of his life contracted to jungle, ridge, valley, and the small number of orders tattooed on his memory. It is easy to romanticize endurance. The actual work of surviving in a tropical jungle is slow, repetitive, and merciless. Shelter must be rebuilt as often as storms tear it down. Food is not a story of sudden triumphs. It is a ledger of small successes stacked against hunger. He learned to listen to the land the way other soldiers learned to read orders. The sound of rain on leaves told him when to move. The flight paths of birds showed where to find water or fruit. Roots, insects, and the occasional wild pig became the staples of a life too far from supply lines to be called anything else. When supplies ran low, he scavenged. He salvaged rice from abandoned stores. He took from fields and the occasional village at night. Those acts of survival were pragmatic and dangerous. They kept him fed. They also kept him distant, both from the community he once belonged to and from the people who now lived on the land he had been ordered to hold. For a time, he was not alone. A handful of men remained with him. They planned raids, shared food, and watched the coastline for proofs of return. Over the years, those numbers dwindled, killed, captured, or surrendered, until only he remained as the world grew noisier with peace. There are reports of skirmishes, of desperate clashes born from confusion and fear. The jungle is not a courtroom. Decisions made in nightlight have consequences that echo into years. He carried the aftermath of those choices with the same stoicism with which he stitched his clothes and sharpened his tools. The long years bend a person towards certain rhythms. Gather, hide, listen, sleep. Memory becomes the form of companionship left, the voice of a commander, the map of a childhood face, the cadence of orders repeated until they become a liturgy. What kept him moving, day after day, was not simply hunger or fear. It was obedience. He had been trained to obey until given legitimate relief. Those orders, issued in the chaos of a collapsing empire, remained for him the single truth. In a way that is hard to narrate from the clean distance of peace, his world was ordered. Each duty completed confirmed his existence. The war that others had put behind them had become the scaffolding of his life. To abandon it without a formal command would be, in his mind, to abandon duty itself. This deep fidelity, arguably noble, arguably tragic, is what made him refuse the leaflets, the radios, the rumored end of fighting. It was not cynicism. It was a soldier keeping faith with the instructions he was given. Decades passed. The world continued without him. Rumors of a holdout became a curious footnote in newspapers and a fascination for travelers. One such traveler, a young Japanese adventurer with a restless curiosity, decided to look for the man. He crossed oceans in search of a story and, improbably, found what he sought. The meeting between the young traveler and the soldier in the jungle is a fragile human scene. The traveler offered proof that Japan had changed, conveyed messages, and asked the soldier to consider surrender. The soldier listened. He did not lay down his weapon. He asked for a different thing. He asked to be relieved by his former commander. That insistence, the need for formal permission from the person who had once led him, is the hinge of the story. For him, orders were not an idea. They were a chain that connected the past to the present. He would wait for a command to break it. News of the discovery traveled. Photographs made their way back home. The world watched with a mixture of amusement, admiration, and awkwardness. For a public used to tidy narratives of war and victory, the idea that a man still maintained battlefield posture decades later was disquieting. Governments and journalists debated what to do. Some wanted a symbolic surrender. Others required the proper ritual that this former soldier demanded. The island, which had been a private geography of survival, became for a moment a public stage. Yet when the traveler returned, he brought not a plea, but an arrangement. He had tracked down the officer who had issued the orders so many years before. That officer, a man who had also lived a life marked by the war, agreed, and he flew out to give the command that would finally unfasten the chain. Imagine a jungle clearing. The soldier, now older and thinner, but still erect in the way soldiers are, listens as a voice from the past speaks his name and gives the command to stand down. It is perhaps the strangest form of closure. Not a negotiated surrender, not a negotiated amnesty, but a formal release from duty by the man who once ordered him. He laid down his rifle. He handed over the tools he had kept for decades. An old service weapon, the last of his ammunition, the relic that once signified sacrificial fidelity. In that gesture, the war finally folded into history for him. When he returned to his country, the reception was complicated. He was a curiosity, a symbol, and to some, a living reminder of a world they had moved beyond. Journalists framed his story in headlines. Politicians saw an opportunity. Others saw the messy aftermath of colonial violence and conflict. He received both a pardon and a public spotlight. The state that had once asked for absolute fealty now extended clemency. Not because the man had been blameless, but because the politics of the moment required it. The pardon allowed him to live without fear of prosecution for acts committed under the fog of decades. Yet the adjustment was not simple. His body, habituated to a life of scarcity and disciplined routine, found the comforts of modern life disorienting. The velocity of change, the noise, the abundance, is often lethal in ways that are not dramatic. A heart taxed by novel foods, a mind jarred by crowds, a soul undone by being made into a spectacle. There is a lesson in such a life that refuses easy moralizing. On one hand, the endurance of the human spirit, learning, adapting, and remaining faithful to a code, is remarkable. On the other, the costs are enormous. Lives were upended, societies changed, and the soldier returned to a nation that had moved on. We can ask how many other lives were shaped by similar rigidities. The orders that do not account for the nuance of time, the rituals that outlive the purpose for which they were made. He was both a product and a prisoner of his training. The story is neither comfortable nor condemnatory. Instead, it sits in that difficult place where history feels personal, where one man's obedience becomes a mirror for the cost of absolute commands, and where endurance and tragedy are braided together. After some years abroad and a brief attempt at a quieter life, he settled into routines that felt smaller but truer. Farming, moving between countries and living in ways that felt less performative than his return had been. He married, tried to write his account, and faced both praise and criticism. When he died many years later, commentators remembered him not only for the headline that once followed his name, but for the complicated human life that followed the surrender. He was no longer simply a soldier who held out. He was a man who had been asked to reconcile obedience with the reality of time. We often tell stories of survival as if they end when the body is saved. The deeper story is the shape of life after survival, the adaptation, the grief, the moral inventory that remains. The soldier who never surrendered finally laid down his arms because a voice from the past asked him to. What remains is not a tidy moral, but a question for us. What do we ask of duty, and what do we owe to the humans who obey?